What would you do if you saw a powerful man, dressed in the finest suit money could buy, shouting at a child whose only crime was trying to sing? Would you look away, or would you listen? In the middle of a crowded street in New York City, that exact scene unfolded. A millionaire, used to being obeyed, tried to silence a trembling boy who held nothing more than a microphone. But what happened next stunned everyone. Because in that moment, the crowd had to make a choice. Follow the voice of wealth or follow the fragile courage of a child. And their decision changed everything. Have you ever been through something like this? A moment when the loudest, most powerful person in the room tried to dominate, but your heart told you to listen somewhere else. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. The man's name was Richard. If you lived in the city, you probably knew his face from newspapers or business magazines. He was the kind of person who walked with an air of authority, his voice carrying weight far beyond the average person's. He believed money gave him the right to control, to silence, to decide whose voice mattered and whose did not. On that afternoon, standing tall and furious, Richard thought he could stop the world with a single command. But what he didn't know was that his power was about to collapse under something much stronger, a child's truth. The boy was Ethan. He wasn't dressed for attention, and his small frame seemed almost lost among the tall buildings and the restless crowd. He didn't have wealth, status, or connections. What he had was a voice, fragile, trembling, but real. And sometimes reality is the very thing the world is desperate to hear. His hands shook as he held the microphone, and his eyes searched the faces around him, hoping someone, anyone, would listen. And then came the interruption. Richard's harsh voice cut through the air, shouting that the boy should stop, that he was disturbing the peace, that nobody wanted to hear him. But here's where things got interesting. Instead of dispersing, instead of siding with the millionaire as everyone usually did, the crowd hesitated. They looked at Ethan, his lips trembling, his eyes filling with tears, and for a split second the noise of the city faded. It wasn't about wealth anymore. It wasn't about who had the loudest voice. It was about something deeper, a choice between arrogance and innocence, between ego and hope. Have you ever felt small in front of someone powerful? Have you ever wondered if your voice mattered in a world that seems to reward only those with money and influence? Ethan's story speaks directly to that quiet fear many of us carry. And yet, what happened on that street revealed a truth that money can't buy. Sometimes, the world chooses to listen not to the one who shouts the loudest, but to the one who dares to speak with sincerity. Phones began to rise from pockets. People leaned forward, waiting to see if Ethan would continue, despite Richard's orders. And when the boy finally opened his mouth and let the first notes escape, everything shifted. The raw vulnerability in his voice made people stop in their tracks. The millionaire's shouts became background noise, while the child's song became the center of the universe for that crowd. And that's where the story truly begins. When one child's courage exposed the limits of wealth and power in front of an entire city. What you're about to see next may change the way you think about strength, truth, and the voices we choose to hear. Because in this story, the millionaire may have shouted, but the world chose differently, and the boy's song was only just beginning. And maybe that's why this story feels so close to all of us, because deep down, we've all been Ethan at some point, standing there, trembling, with something inside us worth sharing, but afraid of being silenced by someone louder, richer, or more powerful. And at the same time, we've all seen people like Richard, using their voice as a weapon, believing the world belongs only to those who shout the strongest. If this already stirs something in you, I'd love to know. What would you have done if you were in that crowd? Would you have stayed quiet, or would you have leaned in to hear the boy's voice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Because when you do, you're not just reacting, you're joining a conversation that makes these stories come alive. Every opinion adds another heartbeat to this space we're building together. And if you're feeling the weight of this moment, if you believe stories like this one deserve to be told and retold, I invite you to leave a like. It might seem like a small action, but it tells me that you're here, that you value this kind of reflection, and it helps this message travel farther than any one of us could take it alone. And of course, if you want to continue walking with me through stories that challenge power, uncover truth, and remind us of the humanity we all share, make sure to subscribe. Your presence here is what makes this community grow, what keeps these voices from being silenced, and what allows us to bring more people into moments like this. So stay close, keep watching, because Ethan's song had only just begun, and what unfolded next will show just how much power lies in a voice the world tried to ignore. The late afternoon light poured down on the streets of Manhattan, painting the grey sidewalks in shades of gold. The noise of the city was alive, horns blaring in the distance, conversations overlapping, the rhythm of footsteps rushing past. But in that small square, something unusual was taking shape. A crowd had formed, drawn not by flashing billboards or storefront displays, but by a boy no taller than the microphone he clutched. His presence seemed almost swallowed by the skyscrapers looming above, yet there was something magnetic in his fragility, something that made strangers pause in the middle of their busy routines. Ethan's hair was slightly messy, his sneakers scuffed, his small hands gripping the stand as though letting go would mean losing everything he had left. The microphone was far too big for him, almost comical, but the determination in his eyes turned that detail into something else, proof of how disproportionate the battle was. He wasn't just standing against the noise of the city. He was standing against the weight of a man whose shadow stretched across the pavement like a warning. Richard's figure towered in sharp contrast. His navy blue suit looked freshly pressed, his polished shoes reflecting the fading sunlight, his watch catching the eye with every movement of his hand. He didn't need to announce who he was. His presence screamed influence. People recognized him, whispered his name under their breath. The aura of money and authority clung to him like a second skin. When he stepped closer, the crowd instinctively shifted, as if gravity itself bent around his wealth. "Stop this nonsense," Richard barked, his deep voice cutting through the air. His tone wasn't a suggestion, it was a command, the kind that usually ended conversations before they began. He was used to being the final word in any room, whether in a board meeting or on a street corner. His glare moved from the boy to the faces in the crowd, searching for affirmation, for the silent agreement he always received. But what he found instead was hesitation. That hesitation was louder than anything spoken. A woman with shopping bags paused, her hand frozen mid-gesture. A construction worker on his break removed his earphones. Two teenagers, phones in hand, stopped scrolling to record. The air carried the weight of a decision being made collectively, a behind-the-scenes shift in mindset that Richard could neither predict nor control. Ethan swallowed hard. His lips trembled, and for a second it looked as if he might retreat, let the man's voice crush his fragile courage. But then his eyes lifted, not to Richard but to the crowd. He wasn't looking for approval. He was searching for something else. Connection, perhaps, or a reminder that his song mattered, even if his voice cracked. "Please," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible through the microphone. "Just one song." The words weren't polished, but they were real, and the crowd felt it. There was a hidden truth in his tone that money couldn't fabricate. Sincerity. People leaned in, not because the sound was strong, but because it was human. Richard scoffed. "Do you think anyone wants to hear this? Look around you. This city doesn't wait for children's games." But the irony was palpable. The city had stopped. Traffic noises faded into the background. Conversations died down. Even the wind seemed to still. The contrast was undeniable. A millionaire shouting, using authority like a weapon, and a child standing with nothing but trembling hands and an unspoken song. The arrogance of wealth versus the humility of innocence. And then, as if time itself allowed him permission, Ethan began. The first note escaped shaky and uncertain, the kind of sound that made you wonder if it would break apart before the melody even started. Yet there was something inside it, a vulnerability that reached into the hearts of those listening. His voice cracked, but it wasn't weakness, it was authenticity. The crowd leaned closer, their breaths caught in anticipation. Each note carried a revelation, peeling away layers of noise, forcing those present to confront the rawness of a child daring to stand tall in front of power. It wasn't about perfection, it was about courage. Richard's jaw tightened. He raised his hand as if to silence the boy again, but this time the eyes of the crowd followed him, not with agreement, but with judgment. He could feel it, the invisible tide turning against him. For the first time in years, his authority wasn't being affirmed, it was being questioned. "Enough!" Richard shouted again, but his voice cracked under the weight of resistance. It wasn't just Ethan's song that defied him. It was the decision of the people around him to listen, to choose differently. This was the hidden truth of that street. Power without empathy loses its grip. A millionaire could raise his voice, but if hearts aligned elsewhere, his words became nothing more than noise. The crowd wasn't just watching a boy sing, they were witnessing a transformation, a revelation that reminded them of something often forgotten in the rush of city life. The sunlight dipped lower, casting long shadows across the pavement. Ethan's figure seemed to glow under the fading rays, fragile but undeniable, his small body holding ground against the giant in front of him. His voice wavered, yet every waver was a note of defiance, a reminder that courage doesn't have to be loud to make an impact. People in the crowd exchanged glances, subtle nods, as if silently agreeing that this moment was bigger than any one of them. It wasn't just about a song, it was about what the song represented, the possibility that even the smallest voice could carry a truth capable of shaking the tallest towers. And as Ethan's voice carried through the microphone, something remarkable began to happen. The millionaire's imposing figure no longer dominated the scene. His expensive suit, his watch, his polished shoes, all the symbols of wealth and control, seemed to shrink in significance against the backdrop of a child's sincerity. That was the environment unfolding in front of everyone, two worlds colliding, two realities standing side by side. On one side, the arrogance of wealth, convinced it could dictate who is heard and who is silenced. On the other, the trembling persistence of a boy daring to prove that sometimes the most fragile voices carry the most enduring echoes. And as the melody filled the air, the decision was no longer Richard's to make. It belonged to a crowd, to the city, to every person whose heart was touched by a song that was never meant to be powerful, but became unstoppable precisely because of its vulnerability. The transformation of that street was only beginning, and the impact of that moment would stretch far beyond what anyone could see that day, carried by phones, by whispers, by the memory of choosing to listen when wealth demanded silence. Richard Davenport had built his empire on the idea that money was louder than any other language. He was the kind of man whose name appeared in glossy business magazines, the type of face you might spot on the cover of Forbes, framed by headlines about mergers, acquisitions, and record-breaking deals. In New York's financial circles, his signature was enough to sway decisions that shaped entire industries. When he walked into a room, people straightened their backs, adjusted their ties, and softened their voices. He didn't demand respect in words, he commanded it by the weight of his presence alone. On that particular evening, standing in the middle of the crowd, Richard wore a tailored navy suit that looked like it had been sculpted directly onto his frame. The watch on his wrist wasn't just an accessory, it was a statement of dominance, a subtle reminder that while others measured their days in minutes, he measured his in millions. His shoes clicked against the pavement with the rhythm of authority, every sound deliberate, as though even the sidewalk had no choice but to yield under his stride. When Richard saw Ethan holding that microphone, he didn't see a boy with a dream. He saw disorder. He saw an interruption in the script of a city where he believed every note should follow the tune of wealth. His brow furrowed, his lips curled into the kind of smile that held no warmth, only disdain. To him, the boy's trembling voice was nothing but background noise, something unworthy of attention. Whose idea was this? Richard muttered, half to himself and half to the crowd, his voice thick with irritation. A child in the middle of the street, disrupting the peace. The people closest to him exchanged glances, but said nothing. They knew the tone well. Richard's words weren't questions. They were declarations of how the world should operate. He was used to being the authority, the one who decided what was acceptable and what was not. His voice carried the kind of weight that made waiters rush, employees apologize, and business rivals crumble under pressure. But there was something different about this moment. The silence of the crowd wasn't obedience. It was hesitation. Behind the scenes, a subtle shift was happening in their collective mindset. They weren't responding to Richard the way they usually would, with immediate agreement or forced applause. Instead, their eyes lingered on Ethan, whose small figure seemed to defy the billionaire's towering frame. Richard didn't notice it at first. He was too focused on the boy, too irritated by the sight of a child daring to take up space he hadn't authorized. His sense of superiority was like a script he couldn't stop reciting. "Do you think this city runs on fairy tales?" he said louder now, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "No one wants to hear your little games. New York is for those who work, those who earn, those who know what it takes to survive." Ethan flinched at the words, his grip tightening on the microphone. The boy's chest rose and fell quickly, as though every breath was a battle. Yet he didn't step down. His silence, his refusal to drop the mic, was its own quiet defiance. For the first time, Richard's words didn't land the way he expected. Normally, such a statement would have been met with nods, murmurs of agreement, maybe even scattered applause from those eager to remain in his good graces. But now the only sound was the faint rustle of jackets and the distant hum of traffic. The crowd wasn't siding with him. They were waiting. Richard's jaw tightened. He despised waiting. He was a man of action, of decisions made in seconds that shifted markets and altered destinies. He wasn't accustomed to being questioned, not by competitors, not by employees, and certainly not by a child. What Richard failed to see was the hidden truth slowly unfolding before him. His wealth had always created an illusion of control, but illusions shatter when tested against something real. Ethan's trembling frame, his fragile courage, was more authentic than the cold perfection of tailored suits and luxury watches. The people in the crowd didn't need another display of power. They craved sincerity, the kind that couldn't be bought or fabricated. "Look at me when I speak to you," Richard commanded, his voice booming across the square. It wasn't just directed at Ethan. It was meant for everyone present. He wanted their eyes, their focus, their obedience, but the irony was painful. The more he shouted, the more eyes shifted away from him and toward the boy. Ethan finally lifted his gaze, not with the confidence of a performer, but with the raw vulnerability of someone who had nothing left to lose. "I just wanted them to hear me," he whispered, his voice trembling through the microphone. The contrast hit the crowd like a revelation. Richard's arrogance, his impatience, his cold superiority, all of it stood in sharp opposition to the boy's simple, honest plea. It was no longer a battle of volume. It was a battle of truth. And for the first time in his life, Richard was losing. He straightened his shoulders, trying to salvage the moment, but it was too late. The current had already shifted. Behind the lenses of dozens of phones, behind the murmurs running through the people gathered, a new story was being written, one that no amount of money or influence could erase. Richard's voice might have been loud, but it was hollow. Ethan's, though fragile, carried impact. The city had seen Richard before. They had watched him cut ribbons, sign contracts, deliver speeches about progress and ambition. But what they hadn't seen was this: his ego unraveling in real time, his authority questioned not by another millionaire, but by a child who refused to be silent. That was the transformation no one expected, the revelation playing out in front of their eyes. And as Richard's frustration grew, his face reddening, his voice straining to reclaim control, something else began to rise in the atmosphere. The crowd's attention was no longer his possession. It belonged to Ethan, and it was about to become undeniable. Ethan Miller didn't look like a headline. He looked like the kid who sits at the back of the bus with earbuds that don't quite fit, the one who hums quietly and stares out the window as if the sky were writing notes only he could hear. His t-shirt had a faded baseball logo, his jeans were a little too short at the ankle, and his jacket, borrowed from his cousin, hung unevenly at the shoulders. Even so, there was a stillness to him that drew attention in the way a candle draws the eye in a darkened room. He didn't posture or announce himself. He breathed, he hesitated, he swallowed, and he stayed. In a city that rewards performance, it was the honesty of his awkwardness that made people focus. The microphone trembled in his hands, and if you listened closely, you could hear the soft click of his nervous thumb against the plastic casing. He was scared, and he wasn't hiding it. That, strangely, was what felt rare. There was no armor, no polish, just a boy whose voice might break at any moment, and a simple dream that had taken him all the way to this square. He hadn't come to New York to be discovered. He lived here, Queens, a third-floor walk-up, where the hallway light flickered and the neighbors kept their doors half open on summer nights to catch a breeze. Music in his house wasn't decoration. It was a lifeline. His mom worked double shifts at a diner on Northern Boulevard, leaving handwritten notes on the kitchen table that said things like, "There's pasta in the pot," and "Sing that song for me when I get home." On the fridge, a magnet held up a crumpled choir flyer from school, the ink smudged from where his wet hands had touched it after washing dishes. He didn't own a professional mic or a studio setup. He learned to sing in the living room between the fridge hum and the radiator hiss, found harmony with the city's heartbeat, sirens in the distance, a neighbor practicing trumpet at odd hours, footsteps overhead that stomped a stubborn rhythm. That was his training. That was his behind the scenes, nothing glamorous, everything real. He had been practicing for this particular moment for 2 weeks, timing it to his mom's split shift. If everything ran late at the diner, she might catch the last 10 minutes on her way home. And he had a plan, a small plan, the kind of plan you make when you're 14 and the world feels too big. Sing one song without running away. That was the goal. Not fame, not viral attention, not record deals. One song from first note to last, no matter who watched or who tried to stop him. If I can do that, he told himself that morning while tying his shoe, maybe I can do the next hard thing. It wasn't about reward. It was about mindset, about the tiny decision to stay in the moment, even when the moment shakes your bones. He wasn't naive about the city. He knew people laughed. He'd felt the sting of being called off-key by kids who never sang, but always judged. He knew that some adults treated his dream like a cute phase, a thing he would outgrow the way you outgrow a favorite hoodie. And he knew that men like Richard, men whose footsteps sounded like verdicts, believed the street had no room for voices that didn't pay rent on a billboard. But Ethan was stubborn in the quiet way only kids can be. He believed in the power of a small melody to travel farther than fear, and he believed that if he could be heard, really heard, maybe, someone else would remember a song they'd long given up on. "That's all I want," he'd murmured once to his mom while drying dishes, "just to be heard, just once." He raised the mic a little higher. His breath fogged the grill. A gust of wind brushed the hair from his eyes, and he blinked as if waking up. He could feel the crowd's curiosity pressing in, not hostile, not yet approving, but waiting. Waiting had a weight. It pushed against his shoulders, made his tongue feel heavy in his mouth. Across from him, the millionaire's silhouette was a sharpened edge against the soft light. Watch gleaming, jaw set, posture like a locked door. Ethan wished he could close his eyes, but he kept them open and looked somewhere past the faces, up toward a slice of sky wedged between buildings. "Okay," he whispered, a word small enough to hide in, and then, slightly louder, "Okay." The first thing to tremble wasn't his voice, it was his hands. His fingers tightened, and the mic squeaked softly. Somebody in the crowd steadied their own breath in response, as if exhaling too fast might knock him over. He could hear his music teacher's advice: start on a note you trust, not the one that tries to impress. He didn't choose the impressive note. He chose the honest one, the one he had sung to the ceiling at midnight, the one he knew by heart, because it felt like a prayer. It came out cracked, like a door hinge opening on a winter morning. He didn't apologize for it. He rested there for half a measure, then reached for the next note, and the next, stitching them together with quiet determination. "I'm not here to be loud," he said gently into the mic between phrases, more to himself than to anyone else. "I'm just here to sing." The words were not theatrical. They were a simple boundary laid down like a line of chalk. His voice followed that chalk line, steadying with each step. He wasn't a prodigy. He was a boy learning in front of strangers, and yet the impact of his honesty was undeniable. The imperfections made the song human. You could hear the day in it, the hallway light flicker, the radiator hiss, the way he'd practiced under his breath on the subway, holding on to the pole with one hand and the melody with the other. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Let him go," a phrase that sounded more like permission than command. A nurse in scrubs closed her eyes. A dog walker paused. A bike courier unclipped his helmet and tucked it under his arm. Life didn't stop. It leaned in. This was a small transformation unfolding in public, the kind that never makes the evening news, but lives rent-free in the mind of anyone lucky enough to witness it. The millionaire's irritation hovered at the edge of the square like a storm that couldn't find purchase, while Ethan's voice, fragile at the edges, stronger at the center, moved through the space like a thread searching for fabric to hold. He thought of the note on the kitchen table that morning. "Sing it brave." It wasn't a command, it was a promise that courage wasn't about volume. Courage was staying when leaving would be easier. "I'm trying," he breathed, barely audible, and the mic caught the confession and carried it, a behind-the-scenes revelation laid open for anyone to hear. The decision to remain was the real performance. Every phrase he completed was a small victory, the kind no one claps for, but the kind that changes a person's posture toward the future. Richard's presence pressed in again, a moving shadow. Ethan felt it but didn't look directly at him. He had learned something important in the last minute. The song was his compass. If he kept following it, he wouldn't get lost in the glare of someone else's disapproval. "One song," he reminded himself. "That's all I promised." The promise was an anchor. It cut through the noise of what people might think, through the fear of breaking, through the temptation to apologize for existing. It was the hidden truth underneath his shaking. Hands, that commitments shape voices, and even a small commitment can echo wider than you expect. He reached the chorus, higher, riskier ground, and for a moment the note faltered. He swallowed quickly and tried again, not pushing this time, just placing the pitch like a careful step on a stair he couldn't see. It held. It didn't soar like in the movies. It held, and that was enough to make a barista in the third row smile without meaning to. "You've got it," someone said softly. A teenage girl near the front lifted her phone, but then lowered it, suddenly unwilling to mediate the moment through a screen. The song was not content. It was a connection, and she wanted to feel it without a layer between. Ethan's eyes found a woman near the back, dark hair pulled into a quick bun, a paper bag from the diner folded under her arm. He didn't know if it was his mom or just a trick of hope, but the sight steadied him. "I can do this," he whispered, and the phrase curled into the melody as if it belonged there. His voice warmed, the crackle smoothing into something cleaner. You could hear relief enter his lungs and leave with the tone. He added a small run he'd practiced 100 times, but never dared to try outside their apartment. And when it landed, he allowed himself half a smile, not triumph, recognition. A landmark passed on a long journey where most of the miles are walked alone. He didn't try to outshout the city. He learned to ride its pulse. Taxi brakes hissed in the distance, and he used the space they made. A bus exhaled at the curb, and he held a note until the sigh ended. Rhythm was everywhere if you listened, not in the rigid tick of a metronome, but in the soft swing of living things breathing. That was the revelation of his craft. For all the talk about talent, so much depended on listening and small decisions. Where to rest, where to lean, when to trust the breath you have, rather than reach for the breath you wish you had. I don't need them to love it, he told himself as the bridge approached. I just need to finish. He thought of the teacher who'd said kindly, the voice comes from the body you have, not the one you think you should have. He thought of his mum's laugh when he'd broken a plate and tried to sing an apology. He thought of the first time he hit a clear note and felt the world align for a second, as if truth were a tuning fork, and his chest had vibrated in agreement. All of that memory folded into a single choice. Keep going. There were tears in his eyes now, not because he was sad, but because he was open. You can cry when you're open. It doesn't mean you're weak. The world tries to make people button themselves up, but songs don't like buttons. They prefer windows. He sang with the windows open, no curtains, no tidy bows. The crowd wasn't evaluating. They were witnessing. And in their stillness, Ethan discovered something no auditorium had ever taught him. The audience isn't the judge. The audience is the room you build with your voice, the room where strangers can breathe together for 4 minutes and remember they're not alone. He reached the last chorus and chose to simplify, to let the melody carry the weight rather than dressing it in technical flourishes. The decision was humble and wise. His tone hovered over the square, and for the first time since he started, it didn't shake. The skyline seemed to lean closer. Even the pigeons on the lamppost stared like tiny critics, reconsidering their stance. A man in a suit loosened his tie without noticing. A child on her father's shoulders hummed one of the notes an octave too high, fearless. The impact was subtle and total. People eased. Their shoulders dropped, their faces softened. In the hush, you could sense a collective recalibration. The city remembering that power isn't always loud, and truth doesn't always wear a spotlight. When the chorus resolved, Ethan didn't rush the final word. He placed it, breathed into it, and let it ring. Exactly as long as it needed to, no more, no less. Then he lowered the mic an inch, eyes still lifted to that thin slice of sky. The sound faded into the evening like a ripple disappearing into a larger sea. For a beat, nobody moved. The pause wasn't confusion, it was reverence for a decision that had been made in front of them, the decision to show up as you are. The journey from the first cracked note to the steady last line was small on paper and enormous in effect. That was the hidden truth. Transformation rarely announces itself with fireworks. It often arrives as a boy finishing a song he promised himself he'd sing. I did it, he whispered. Not for applause, not even for the crowd, but for the kitchen note and the radiator hiss and the hallway light that buzzed when you flicked it twice. His words floated into the square and dissolved, but the meaning stayed. Across from him, the figure of the millionaire remained, defined and diminished all at once, a monument to a mindset that had ruled rooms but was losing ground to something more elemental. The city, which so often rewards the spectacle, was siding with sincerity, and even before the first clap could rise, the story had already shifted its balance, leaning toward the voice that entered without armor and left a door open for anyone willing to step through. Richard's voice cracked across the square like the snap of a whip. That's enough! Put that thing down before you embarrass yourself. His words weren't just directed at Ethan. They were designed to cut through him, to leave a mark that would sting longer than any silence. The crowd felt it immediately. Conversations stopped, footsteps froze, the casual rhythm of the street collapsed into stillness. What moments earlier had been a fragile thread of hope now trembled on the verge of breaking. Ethan's fingers tightened around the microphone, his knuckles pale against the dark plastic. For a moment, his small body swayed as though the weight of Richard's words had shoved him backward. His eyes darted to the ground, then back to the crowd, searching for something. Approval, maybe, or simply a reason not to run. The air grew thick with hesitation. No one moved, no one spoke, as though the entire street was holding its breath. Richard thrived in silence like this. He mistook it for victory, the kind of victory he had seen countless times in boardrooms where one glare could silence a proposal, where one booming no could erase weeks of preparation. His ego fed on these moments, and he believed he had already won. "This city doesn't have time for childish noise," he said, his voice heavy with disdain. "Go home. Leave the stage to people who matter." But the strange thing about silence is that it doesn't always mean agreement. Sometimes silence is suspense, the heartbeat of a decision not yet made. That was the hidden truth Richard overlooked. Behind the quiet faces in the crowd, something was shifting, something he couldn't see, but would soon feel. The weight of people questioning whether his authority was as unshakable as he wanted them to believe. Ethan's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but the words tangled. All that came out was a whisper, caught halfway between apology and defiance. "I just wanted to try." It wasn't loud, but it carried, because the microphone amplified not just his voice, but his vulnerability. Those 6 words were enough to ripple through the crowd like a spark dropped in. "Dry grass." Richard scoffed. Try is for the weak. In this world you either succeed or you get out of the way." His voice boomed louder, as though sheer volume could prove him right. The crowd flinched at his tone, but their eyes didn't return to him. They stayed fixed on Ethan, the boy whose knees shook but whose grip didn't loosen. The tension grew unbearable. Every second stretched longer than it should. Every heartbeat a question hanging in the air. Would Ethan lower the mic, defeated? Would he step off the small patch of pavement that had become his stage, or would he do the unthinkable, sing anyway? The boy's breath came shallow, quick, uneven, and for a terrifying instant it looked like Richard's cruelty had crushed him. His shoulders dipped, his chin dropped, and a murmur moved through the crowd. You could feel the audience's nervous energy, the ache of people who wanted him to fight back, but feared he wouldn't. And then, as though something ancient and stubborn rose inside him, Ethan lifted his head. His voice cracked when he spoke again, but the words were steady enough to plant themselves firmly in the silence. "I'm not leaving." The phrase wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It was a decision, a line drawn with trembling hands, but an iron will. The kind of decision that transforms a moment into memory. The people closest to him felt it first, the subtle shift of power that came not from noise, but from conviction. Richard's face darkened, his eyes narrowing as if he couldn't believe a boy had dared to answer back. "You don't understand who you're talking to," he snapped, his jaw rigid. "Do you think these people came to hear you squeak into a microphone? You're nothing. You're wasting their time." Ethan's lip quivered, but he didn't step down. His chest rose and fell, until he found enough air to whisper into the mic. "Then let them decide." The crowd stirred, heads turned, whispers spread. Richard had demanded obedience, but Ethan had offered a choice. And that choice was more powerful than the millionaire's arrogance. In that instant, the narrative began to slip from Richard's hands. The people weren't cheering yet. They weren't clapping, not even smiling, but they were watching differently. Their silence no longer belonged to Richard. It belonged to Ethan, to the possibility that this boy might defy humiliation and do what he came to do. Richard stepped closer, his polished shoes striking the pavement with deliberate force. His shadow fell across Ethan, dark and heavy, like a curtain threatening to close before the performance could begin. "Don't test me, boy," he growled. "You don't know how fast I can end this." Ethan's knees knocked together, his fingers slipping slightly on the mic. He could feel the cold sweat gathering on his temples, the sting of fear digging into his chest. For a heartbeat, he considered stepping down. It would be easy, so easy to surrender, to let the man win and tell himself he had been foolish for even trying. But something stronger than fear tugged at him, his mother's note, the promise he had made to himself, the hidden truth that one song was worth the risk. "I have to," he whispered, almost inaudible. His lips brushed the mic, and the words hummed through the speaker like a secret no one could unhear. "I have to sing." The crowd leaned in. The silence that once threatened to suffocate him now felt like anticipation, a collective inhale waiting for release. Richard glared, waiting for the boy to crumble. But Ethan, trembling, broken in posture yet unbroken in spirit, held his ground. His chest swelled with the breath that would carry the first note. The moment stretched, fragile as glass and heavy as stone. Richard's anger pulsed in the air, Ethan's courage flickered in the balance, and the crowd waited, their decision forming like a tide rising beneath their feet. The clash wasn't physical. It was deeper, a battle of presence, of mindset, of who would define the truth of this night. And as Ethan parted his lips to let the sound escape, the square itself seemed to tilt toward him, caught between the weight of power and the fragile echo of hope that was about to change everything. The sound that escaped Ethan's lips was fragile, almost too soft for the square, yet it carried with it something stronger than volume, truth. The first note quivered, cracked on the edge like glass about to splinter, and for a second even he thought it might collapse. His heart pounded so loudly in his chest that he wondered if the mic was picking it up. His palms were slick, his knees knocking together, and for an instant the temptation to stop and run was overwhelming. But the note lingered, weak, imperfect, human, and the imperfection became its own kind of invitation. People leaned forward as though catching a secret too delicate to risk losing. Richard reacted instantly. He waved his arm like he was brushing away smoke. "Stop that noise!" he bellowed, his voice booming across the space. "I said enough." His command rang out, sharp and heavy, the kind of order that once would have silenced a room in seconds. But this wasn't a boardroom, and for the first time, his authority didn't carry the same weight. Something was changing, because instead of stepping back, Ethan closed his eyes and pushed through. His voice broke again on the next phrase, but the crack only deepened the sincerity. It wasn't polished, it wasn't trained, but it was undeniably real. And in a world addicted to spectacle and performance, reality was something the crowd didn't want to look away from. His words weren't chosen for grandeur, they were chosen for survival. Each lyric felt like a thread stitching together his fear with his hope, and people felt the seam tighten inside their own chests. A woman in the front row whispered, "Let him sing," not as a demand, but as though she was reminding everyone of something obvious. Her words didn't compete with Richard's anger. They cut right through it. The crowd shifted, shoulders angling, heads tilting toward the boy instead of the man. For the first time since this began, Ethan wasn't the one being judged. Richard was. The millionaire's face flushed red, the veins in his neck tightening as he shouted again, "Do you hear yourselves? You're listening to a child, a child. This is pathetic." His words came with the full force of his pride, but pride has a way of sounding hollow when it's thrown against innocence. The harder Richard pushed, the more obvious the contrast became. His voice was loud, but it lacked connection. Ethan's was small, trembling, but tethered directly to the hearts of those around him. Ethan felt the shift before he saw it. Somewhere between the second and third line, he realized people weren't turning away. They were leaning in. He could feel their silence differently now, not heavy, not condemning, but supportive, as if they were holding space for him to keep going. It was a strange, Sensation, like the square itself had turned into a room built just for his song. His chest loosened, his breath steadied, and the melody that had cracked earlier began to smooth, not perfectly, but enough to carry weight. "I just want you to hear me," he said softly between lines, his voice picked up by the mic, filling the air with a vulnerability that no one could ignore. And the crowd responded, not with applause, not with cheering, but with attention. They gave him the one thing Richard couldn't take away: presence. Richard stomped a step closer, his polished shoes striking the pavement like a gavel. "You're wasting their time," he roared. "End this now." But the people didn't turn to him. They didn't nod, didn't mutter in agreement. Instead, phones tilted upward, lenses pointed not at the millionaire, but at Ethan. The very tool Richard had always used for publicity and power was now documenting his loss of control, his unraveling in the face of a boy who had nothing but a fragile voice and the courage to use it. The shift was subtle yet undeniable. Every decision made in that square was now bending away from Richard and toward Ethan. You could feel it in the way people's shoulders relaxed, in the way strangers exchanged quiet nods, in the way the air itself seemed to vibrate differently. Richard still shouted, but his words slid off the moment like water on glass, leaving no imprint. Ethan's song, however, clung. It wasn't about skill. It wasn't about pitch-perfect notes or grand performance. It was about sincerity, and sincerity has a strange way of resonating louder than perfection. Each time Ethan's voice wavered, it reminded the crowd of their own fragility, their own hidden truths they rarely dared to share. His courage wasn't in the strength of his tone, it was in the decision to keep singing even when his voice faltered. That kind of courage was contagious. A man near the back lowered his briefcase, setting it gently on the ground. A teenager removed her headphones, letting the sound of the boy's song replace her playlist. Even a police officer stationed at the corner leaned slightly forward, one hand resting on his radio, but the other resting quietly against the metal barrier, eyes fixed on the small figure in the center. This wasn't just about music anymore. It was about the impact of witnessing someone risk humiliation for the sake of truth. Richard's impatience cracked into desperation. "You fools! You're encouraging!" "Weakness! This is weakness!" he thundered, his arms flailing now, his carefully composed demeanor slipping into something messy, uncontrolled. For a man who had built his life on image, the unraveling was visible, and people noticed. The louder he grew, the smaller he seemed. The quieter Ethan sang, the larger his presence became. It was transformation in real time, the kind that doesn't announce itself with fireworks, but with revelation. Ethan kept his eyes closed, not to block out Richard, but to stay tethered to the song. Inside the melody, he found something steady, something no amount of shouting could touch. His voice still cracked here and there, but he no longer cared. "If I stop now," he thought, "he wins. If I keep going, maybe I find out who I really am." His breath carried the next phrase, and the phrase after that, and suddenly the cracks began to sound less like mistakes and more like texture, the kind of detail that makes a painting real. The boy's voice rose into a refrain that caught in the crowd's chest like a collective inhale. For the first time, you could hear someone humming along faintly, not enough to drown him out, just enough to support. A ripple passed through the listeners, subtle but unmistakable. They had chosen, and Richard felt it. The realization twisted in his gut, visible in the clench of his fists and the stiff set of his shoulders. He had lost something he didn't even think could be taken from him, the crowd's allegiance. It was no longer his show. It was Ethan's moment, and nothing, not money, not influence, not the sharpest command, could take it back. As the boy's voice carried into the evening, fragile yet undeniable, the crowd leaned closer still, each person making a decision with their silence. They weren't following wealth or authority, they were following courage. The tension hadn't dissolved, it had transformed into something richer, something alive. And though Richard's shouts still echoed across the square, the people had already made their choice. They were listening to the boy. The melody hung in the air, imperfect yet pure, and in that suspended moment, the story pivoted completely. What had begun as a clash between arrogance and vulnerability was shifting into a revelation neither Richard nor Ethan could have fully expected, the kind of turning point that reshapes not only the moment, but the journey ahead. And as the song continued, carried by trembling notes that somehow felt stronger than steel, the city leaned in further, waiting for what would come next. At first it was just a shift in posture. Someone near the front uncrossed her arms, a man lowered his briefcase to the concrete, a kid on his dad's shoulders leaned forward like a sunflower turning toward light. Then came the soft cascade of phones rising, screens blooming in the dusky air, not to gawk, but to preserve, to document a hidden truth taking shape. The city was choosing the boy. A murmur rolled through the square, curiosity, melting into recognition, and in that recognition you could hear decisions being made, quiet, private, and unanimous. The melody kept threading itself through the listeners, imperfect and sincere, and people began to breathe with it, the way a crowd does when they get pulled into a single, shared moment. Someone whispered, "Listen to that," and another answered, "I am." It wasn't loud yet, it was alignment. Richard felt the alignment before he understood it. Authority is easier to wear when nobody tests the seams. Now the seams were straining. He lifted his chin as if height could restore the hierarchy, but height doesn't matter when attention has already left you. "This is ridiculous," he snapped to no one and everyone, the syllables clipped like torn paper. "You're encouraging failure." His voice sought the old obedience, the reflexive nods, the agreeable hum. What he heard instead was a sound he hadn't allowed in years, people ignoring him. The cameras weren't pointed at Richard's watch or Richard's jawline or Richard's posture. They were framed on the boy, the trembling hands, the breath that steadied mid-phrase. Images don't lie as cleanly as words, and the frames now told a story he couldn't edit. Ethan didn't see all of that, not exactly. He felt it as warmth, like stepping from shadow into late afternoon sun. His shoulders loosened half an inch. "Okay," he breathed, a promise to the next bar, then the next. He let the refrain climb and learned, right there, that a voice can grow inside attention that is kind. "I can do this," he said into the mic, and the words didn't boast, they bridged. A woman in scrubs at the edge of the crowd pressed her hand to her chest like she'd been holding her breath for weeks and had finally remembered how to exhale. A teenage boy tugged out one earbud, then the other, letting the city's playlist swap to something unscripted. Two construction workers, boots dusted white, tapped time against the base of a barricade. Not to hurry him, but to hold the tempo steady, like friends running alongside a marathoner for one block so he doesn't lose pace. The first pockets of applause appeared the way spring appears in the northeast, tentative, scattered, a few brave bursts testing the air. A clap here, a couple there, then a hush again, as people remembered they didn't want to crush the fragile line he was walking. The song carried a second verse, and something loosened further, a behind-the-scenes release of tension that had nothing to do with pitch and everything to do with courage. Applause grew at the edges and stepped toward the center, not a roar yet, more like a tide that keeps touching your shoes even when you step back. "That's it, kid," someone called softly, as if speaking any louder might break the surface of the moment. "You've got it," another voice answered from somewhere near the deli sign. Richard demanded reality conform. "Enough of this," he barked, louder this time, trying to outshout what could not be outshouted, a tension that had shifted by choice. He stepped forward, the heel of his shoe striking the pavement like a gavel, but the gavel no longer meant verdict. A father lifted a hand, not to stop Richard, but to keep his daughter's view clear. A jogger slowed, then stopped entirely, resting one sneaker on the low curb and tilting his head to listen. The jogger kept his earbuds in, volume down, as if negotiating with himself about how this would fit into his evening. Then he tugged the cord free and dropped it into his pocket. "Keep going, kid," he said, mostly to the air. Whispers gathered into a soft chorus. He's brave, he's shaking, and still doing it. This is what a heart sounds like. The words weren't flattery. They were field notes from a moment of transformation in real time. People love to talk about mindset like it's a product you can hold. Here it was, breathing on a square of concrete, deciding not to break. The applause returned, stronger, and with it the phones, not held high as shields but as lanterns. Comments began forming as captions in the minds of the spectators. I was there. You won't believe this. This boy changed my commute. And with each mental caption, Richard's grip loosened another notch. Influence is a current. Once it reroutes, the old channels run dry. A grey-haired man in a blazer, the sort who might once have lined up for Richard's keynote, cupped his hands and called, "Sing, son." There was no irony in it. From somewhere behind Ethan, a bus released its long, slow sigh, and he let the end of a phrase ride that breath until the street exhaled with him. One more, he whispered to himself, not bargaining with fear now, but partnering with it. The next line arrived steadier. He opened his eyes and found not a wall of judgment, but faces softened by the impact of seeing someone keep a promise to himself. That's what people were responding to, maybe more than the melody. The decision, the simple human decision to stand inside humiliation and keep the line moving forward. Richard's aura cracked where certainty had always covered him. He glanced around for the old reflexes, the assistant who would intervene, the security guard who would appear, the crowd that would nod on cue. The assistant wasn't here, the guard didn't come, and the crowd had stopped taking cues. He raised his hands as if conducting an orchestra, but the players were reading a different score. "What is wrong with all of you?" he demanded. "This is sentimentality. It's weak." The word landed like a relic from a museum people no longer visited. Strength in this square now sounded like a voice that shook and kept singing. The recording lights dotted the dim like slow stars. Two tourists argued in gentle stage whispers about whether to film vertical or horizontal, then laughed and settled on horizontal because people will want to see the whole thing. A barista, clocking out from the corner cafe, lifted her apron over her head and tied it at her waist like a sash, queening herself for the coronation of a moment she already knew she'd be telling later. "He sounds like my brother used to," she murmured to the stranger beside her, and the stranger replied, "He sounds like me when I was 15 and didn't quit yet." Stories started crossfading in the square, private histories sinking to the beat of a public refrain. Ethan reached the place in the song where he had always faltered during practice, the narrow bridge. That climbs, waits, then jumps. He swallowed, found the step and jumped anyway. The note didn't soar, it held, and the holding drew a clean line through the crowd. This was the pivot, the revelation you only recognize once it passes. The applause that followed was not permission granted afterward. It was accompaniment offered mid-flight. Hands met, not thunderous but tight and true, like nails tapping into wood to keep a beam in place while the house is still being framed. Even the officer at the corner, who had been watching the edges of the crowd the way officers do, let his posture relax an inch. He tilted his head, considered the boy as if measuring a new variable in the equation of the evening, and then returned his gaze to the flow of people with the faintest smile. The city still needed watching, but not every risk lived where the loud voices pointed. The real risk tonight was missing a small miracle because someone in a suit told you not to look. Richard's next attempt at control came out thinner. "This is a street, not a talent show," he insisted, like the distinction should carry moral weight. But the sentence arrived late to a conversation that had already moved on. Laughter flickered, not at Ethan, but at the absurdity of a man with everything trying to confiscate a boy's 4 minutes of air. A college student with a camera rig lifted it to her shoulder and began filming with the quiet confidence of someone who knows a story when she sees one. "You'll want audio," a guy beside her said, offering a small shotgun mic. "I got it," she replied, never taking her eye from the frame. Ethan didn't need their gear to feel their choice. Choice is tactile. It changes the texture of a room or a sidewalk or a square. He rode the texture, not as a surfer rides a wave, too glamorous an image, but as a person rides the steady rise of a staircase he's been building in his mind all month. Don't rush, he told himself. Place it. He placed the notes like small stones you can step across without falling in. His voice didn't bloom into perfection. It settled into truth, and people prefer truth when they're given permission to hear it. Applause began to arrive in the pauses now, respectful and rhythmic, the way you clap at a poetry reading, when the line hits just right. A kid in a Yankees cap started keeping time on his thigh. A woman with a stroller hummed harmony under her breath, a low shore for his melody to lap against. The square became an instrument not built of steel or strings, but of strangers choosing, tiny decision by tiny decision, to listen. In the uneven theater of street life, it felt like a rehearsal turning into opening night without anyone calling places. Richard's authority crumbled not with a crash, but with an unraveling. The threat in his posture lost voltage. He looked like a man trapped inside the wrong story. His mouth opened, then closed. He tried to organize the chaos with a gesture and ended up conducting air. He could buy lights, stages, airtime, billboards that painted a version of himself across blocks, but he could not purchase what Ethan had stumbled into by refusing to stop. The alignment of attention around a vulnerable center. The crowd did not hate Richard. That would have been too simple. They saw through him, and seeing through is quieter and more permanent than hate. "I'm almost there," Ethan said softly, as if encouraging his own feet to keep moving. He let the bridge resolve and returned to the chorus with a courage that wasn't loud, but had depth now, a timbre you get only after suffering through a minute that wanted to break you. The line carried, then the line after that, and the applause swelled between phrases, not to interrupt, but to undergird. Like scaffolding you barely notice until you realize the building would have fallen without it. Phones recorded, yes, but the better recorder was the body. Goosebumps collecting along forearms, a lump settling in throats. Eyes shining a little too much for a Tuesday. The whispers changed vocabulary. Where minutes earlier you could hear the uneasy notes of risk. Is he going to make it? Now you heard the language of impact. I needed this. That took guts. He stayed. The shift mattered. It meant the audience was no longer auditing the performance. They were participating in a revelation. And in that participatory space, community happens. Not the performative kind that posts and vanishes, but the kind that leaves people walking home a little slower, phone in pocket, thinking about their own unfinished song. Richard took one last breath to speak, then let it go without words. It was the most honest thing he had done all night. For a moment he looked not like a villain, but like a man who had built his life around the wrong metric and was just now catching up to the cost. He stepped back one pace. No one cheered the retreat. No one needed to. The applause belonged elsewhere. Ethan reached toward the final refrain and held it like a hand you don't want to drop in a crowd. He didn't push. He trusted. The square answered with a rising swell, palms meeting in a pattern that felt both improvised and inevitable. If you looked closely, you could see how small decisions add up to a turning. The jogger still standing, the officer still listening, the nurse still touching her chest, the kid in the Yankees cap still tapping time, the college filmmaker tracking the frame that would later look like fate. Every life at the edge of the frame had inched a degree in a new direction. That was the journey inside the journey, the revelation behind the revelation. When the refrain eased into the delicate space before an ending, Ethan didn't claim the moment. He shared it by breathing into the pause and letting the square breathe with him. The sound rested on the lip of silence, not finished, not broken, poised, an intake of possibility. Applause didn't rush to fill it. The crowd held, understanding. Without instruction that the next beat mattered, that something more than a song was calibrating itself in that Manhattan light, and the story, having chosen its center, was preparing to show what comes of a choice like that. Richard had built his entire identity around control. Control of the boardroom, control of his image, control of the narrative wherever he went. His voice had always been enough to bend people into silence, his wealth enough to command attention, his name enough to shape decisions. Yet here, on an ordinary street corner in Manhattan, none of those currencies were working. The song that slipped from Ethan's trembling lips was not polished, not flawless, but it carried a force Richard couldn't understand. It cut through him, not with grandeur, but with something far more dangerous to his armor, sincerity. At first, he resisted. His jaw clenched, his nostrils flared, and he stood taller, as if posture alone could reassert dominance. He told himself this was temporary, that the crowd was indulging in sentimentality, that it would pass. But the longer the boy sang, the more the atmosphere shifted, and the harder it became to deny that something irreversible was happening. For the first time in his adult life, Richard felt the ground beneath him tilt. His confusion showed in the twitch of his brow, the way his eyes darted from face to face in the crowd. He expected to find loyalty, to see someone, anyone, avert their gaze in submission. Instead, he found only eyes fixed on Ethan. People weren't watching Richard anymore, and the realization stung worse than open ridicule. Attention, the resource he had always monopolized, had been stolen from him by a child who had nothing to offer but a voice that cracked under the weight of its own honesty. The shame crept in slowly, like a shadow lengthening at dusk. He tried to shake it off, muttering to himself, "This is absurd. This is weakness." But the words felt brittle, collapsing in his mouth. Before they could convince even him, for the first time, he saw the reflection of himself not in mirrors lined with gold, but in the crowd's quiet disapproval. Every shout he made, every attempt to reassert power, only revealed more of his desperation. And desperation does not command, it pleads. Richard had always believed money was the sharpest tool, the one thing that pierced through doubt and secured obedience, but as Ethan's voice grew steadier, each lyric carried the kind of impact money could never buy. The boy wasn't singing to impress, he was singing to survive, to be heard, to fulfill a promise to himself. That truth pressed against Richard's chest like a weight he couldn't lift. The words, though sung softly, dug into him deeper than any accusation ever had. He remembered boardrooms filled with applause, but now he noticed the difference. Those claps had been transactional, echoes of fear and ambition. This applause, genuine, unscripted, was born of recognition. It was the sound of people choosing sincerity over spectacle, truth over wealth, humanity over hierarchy. He stood among them, but he wasn't part of it. He was the cautionary tale standing in the corner of a revelation. The confusion gave way to something sharper, shame. His cheeks burned, not from the cold, but from the piercing realization that he had become the villain in a story he didn't know he was part of. He had tried to silence a boy whose only weapon was hope, and the crowd had chosen the boy. Instead, for the first time, Richard saw himself through their eyes. Not powerful, not inspiring, but arrogant, loud, and deeply alone. "I didn't mean," he started, but the words stuck. His throat tightened as if honesty were a language he had forgotten. He had meant it, though. He had meant every cruel syllable, every attempt to crush the boy's spirit. He had meant it, until the moment the song revealed the smallness of his cruelty. And now, standing there, the certainty of who he thought he was began to unravel. Ethan's words in the song weren't directed at him, but they might as well have been. Each phrase was a mirror, and in it, Richard didn't see the man he told the world he was. He saw the cost of living a life where silence was enforced, not earned. He saw the hollowness of a reputation built on intimidation. He saw how thin his influence became when stripped of context and left to stand against a child's fragile courage. He whispered under his breath, too quiet for anyone to hear. "Why does this hurt?" The question wasn't rhetorical. He truly didn't understand how a boy's song could pierce deeper than the harshest critiques of investors, rivals, or the press. Yet it did. It unstitched him thread by thread, pulling apart the facade he had spent decades constructing. His power, so carefully staged, looked pitiful here. His wealth, so often paraded, seemed irrelevant. What terrified him most wasn't the crowd's rejection. It was the possibility that Ethan's song had revealed something to him he could no longer ignore. That maybe all along, the control he thought he had was nothing more than a performance. And without an audience willing to believe it, he was just a man shouting at a child in the street. That hidden truth lodged itself inside him, and no amount of shouting could shake it loose. Richard's lips trembled as he opened his mouth again, but no words came out. The arrogance had drained, replaced by the hollow ache of a man realizing he no longer had the script. He looked at his own hands, polished nails and gold rings, and for the first time wondered what they had actually built. Around him, the crowd clapped softly in rhythm with Ethan's song, their attention sealed to the boy. Richard wasn't part of it, and the exclusion was absolute. He took a step back instinctively, as though distance might shield him from the revelation unfolding in front of him. His confusion blurred into shame, and the shame blurred into something even more unsettling: powerlessness. Richard, who had always defined the terms of every interaction, was no longer in control. His words were meaningless here. His authority had collapsed in real time, leaving him naked in the eyes of strangers who no longer feared him. And all the while the boy kept singing. Each note was a quiet defiance, each lyric a declaration that there are forces stronger than wealth, louder than arrogance, deeper than power. Richard had no choice but to hear it, because the song wasn't asking for permission, it was demanding recognition. And in that recognition, Richard felt himself unraveling piece by piece as the boy's voice carried the truth into the night and pulled the story towards something he could no longer stop. The final note lingered in the square, like the echo of something too delicate to vanish. For a beat, nobody moved. Then it happened. The release, the eruption of applause that spread outward in waves. It wasn't polite clapping, the kind you hear at a conference or a staged performance. It was alive, uneven, urgent, like the crowd had been holding back tears and finally found a way to let them out through their palms. The square vibrated with sound, and Ethan, still gripping the microphone, blinked as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The people closed in, not to crowd him but to protect him. Strangers who minutes earlier had been bystanders now leaned forward, their bodies forming a circle of quiet defiance against the arrogance that had tried to silence him. A man in work boots shouted, "Sing it again!" A teenager with bright red headphones lifted her phone high and whispered, "This is going to go everywhere." A woman in scrubs pressed her hands together and nodded at Ethan like he had just reminded her of something she thought she'd lost. Support wasn't abstract. It was immediate, tangible, visible in the way they positioned themselves, in the way they chose him. Ethan lowered the mic, his chest heaving. He wasn't smiling broadly, not yet. His eyes were wide, his lips parted slightly as though he was still processing the transformation of the moment. He whispered, almost to himself, "They heard me." And those 3 words carried more weight than any standing ovation could ever hold. He hadn't been looking for fame, he had been looking for recognition, and now, in the simplest and most undeniable way, he had it. Richard stood just outside that circle, the distance between him and the crowd more profound than any physical step could measure. His face, once sharp with disdain, now sagged with the heaviness of realization. He had tried to shout louder than truth, and the attempt had failed. The applause, the attention, the warmth, none of it belonged to him anymore. It wasn't stolen. It was surrendered, because power has always been borrowed from people's willingness to follow, and in this square, that willingness had shifted. He muttered under his breath, "This can't be happening." But it was. He had confronted competitors, critics, even governments, and never once had he felt powerless. Yet here, before a boy who owned nothing but a cracked voice and determination, he felt stripped of everything that once made him untouchable. He looked down at his own hands, at the expensive watch glinting against his wrist, and it struck him how little it mattered. What use is wealth when hearts turn against you? What good is authority when no one listens? For years, Richard had believed that influence was measured in money, in contracts, in signatures that bound others to his will. But here was a revelation unfolding in front of him. Influence was attention freely given, and once it was gone, no price could buy it back. His empire suddenly felt like a castle made of paper, impressive from a distance, but crumbling when touched by something as simple as a child's truth. The boy hadn't humiliated him. That was what gnawed at Richard most. Ethan hadn't tried to expose him, hadn't targeted him, hadn't made this a contest. The boy had simply sung because he needed to, because he had promised himself one song, and that sincerity had done what Richard's shouting could not. It had gathered the crowd and turned them into witnesses of something real. That truth weighed heavier than shame. It was conviction, and conviction was not a currency Richard had ever learned to carry. Ethan's shoulders relaxed as the applause washed over him. Someone stepped forward to pat his back, another placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, and suddenly the boy was surrounded not by fear but by community. The square had become his stage, but more than that, it had become his proof. You don't need permission to be heard. I did it, he whispered again, this time louder, his voice trembling with relief rather than fear. The crowd answered with a cheer, and Richard flinched. It was not the cheer itself that unsettled him, but what it symbolized. Allegiance had been transferred. He had always assumed loyalty was his by default, that respect was automatic. Now he saw how fragile that assumption was. Respect wasn't something you demanded, it was something you earned, and wealth couldn't shortcut the process. Richard took a half-step forward, as if to reclaim something, but stopped when he realized the eyes of the people were no longer neutral. They were protective. The circle around Ethan wasn't just support, it was a boundary. It said, without words, "You've done enough." The same crowd that once admired Richard's presence was now guarding the boy against him. That shift was irreversible. The shame sank deeper, transforming into the unsettling recognition of who he had become. He whispered again, though softer this time, "Why does this hurt so much?" But the answer was already in front of him. It hurt because he was finally seeing the hidden truth. That power means nothing when hearts choose differently. A child had stood in the space where Richard's authority once ruled, and the people had chosen the child, not because of status, not because of influence, but because of sincerity. Ethan looked out at the faces, strangers who had chosen to stand with him, and the corner of his mouth lifted into a cautious smile. He wasn't naive. He knew the world was bigger than this square, harsher than this moment of support. But he also knew something fundamental now. Even the smallest voice could tip the balance when it carried truth. "Thank you," he said softly, and the mic caught it. Carrying gratitude into every corner of the crowd, Richard lowered his head. For the first time, silence wasn't his weapon, it was his only refuge. He couldn't command, couldn't demand, couldn't buy back what was lost. He was no longer the center, and in losing that, he had to face himself. The man who had mistaken fear for respect, intimidation for admiration, control for connection. The revelation was brutal, but it was undeniable. And while Richard wrestled with the collapse of his illusion, the crowd leaned closer to Ethan, wrapping him in the kind of support that had nothing to do with wealth or power. It was raw, human, and unshakable. In that circle, Richard was no longer relevant. The choice had been made, the balance tipped, and the boy's truth had outweighed the millionaire's arrogance. The night air carried the echoes of applause and song, blending them into the rhythm of the city. For those who had witnessed it, this wasn't just an evening. It was a transformation etched into memory. And as the noise settled into a quiet hum of voices and footsteps, the story wasn't closing. It was expanding, pulling everyone toward the next revelation that was waiting just beyond the square. The square slowly began to thin as the evening deepened, but the energy of what had unfolded didn't fade with the dispersing crowd. People walked away in groups, murmuring to each other about what they had just witnessed, their voices carrying the lingering weight of revelation. Some smiled to themselves, others shook their heads in disbelief, and a few still replayed Ethan's cracked yet unbreakable notes on their phones, needing to confirm that what they'd felt was real. The city, which so often demanded speed and indifference, had been interrupted by something unusual: sincerity. And sincerity has a way of following you long after you've left the scene. Richard remained where he was, as though frozen, watching people drift away without looking back at him. His suit still gleamed. In the fading streetlight, his watch still sparkled, but both felt like props in a theater that had closed its curtains. He had spent years believing wealth gave him the final word, that his voice was the loudest in any room, simply because he could afford to make it so. But the truth had never been louder than in this square. Money could not drown out honesty. Influence, real influence, was not about silencing others, but about giving them a reason to listen. He whispered to himself, "They didn't need me at all." And the confession burned, because for the first time it was true. Ethan, still surrounded by a few who lingered to encourage him, let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The relief was visible in his shoulders, in the way his trembling hands finally steadied as he lowered the microphone. He didn't say much, only a simple "thank you" to the faces nearest him. But even those two words carried the same weight as his song, unpolished, vulnerable, and utterly real. He hadn't planned to be a symbol, hadn't imagined he would force a millionaire into silence. He had only wanted to keep a promise to himself, to sing one song all the way through. And yet, that simple decision had sparked something larger than he could grasp. What happened in that square wasn't about fame or headlines. It wasn't about the video clips already beginning to circulate online. It was about the hidden truth revealed in plain sight. Courage, no matter how small, carries impact far beyond the moment in which it's born. Ethan's cracked notes had exposed the fragility of arrogance, reminding everyone present that the human heart responds more to honesty than to power. In that revelation, the crowd hadn't just witnessed a performance, they had participated in a transformation. And what about Richard? His silence wasn't defeat in the ordinary sense. It was the unraveling of a mindset he had trusted his entire life. The applause had not merely chosen Ethan, it had forced Richard to confront himself. Wealth had built walls around him, walls he thought were unshakable, but a child's trembling voice had slipped through the cracks and dismantled the illusion. For the first time, he realized that true respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. That night he discovered he had none. The power he thought he owned was never really his. It had always belonged to the people willing to grant it. And in that square, the people had made their decision. The lesson wasn't just Richard's to carry. It belonged to everyone who stood there, to everyone who later heard the recording, to anyone who had ever doubted whether their voice mattered. Because what unfolded in that city corner was proof that even the smallest voice can tip the balance when it speaks with courage. It showed that transformation often begins in unexpected places, not in grand speeches or luxurious halls, but in ordinary streets where truth decides to show up. The impact of that night wasn't measured in applause alone. It was measured in the quiet decisions people made afterward. The nurse who remembered why she had chosen her job. The teenager who picked up her guitar again after months of letting it collect dust. The office worker who realized he had been silent in too many meetings and promised himself he'd speak next time. The ripple effect of sincerity is impossible to track, but it is impossible to stop. Richard walked away eventually, his steps slower than they had been when he arrived. He didn't shout again. He didn't try to explain himself. For the first time, he had no script. And maybe that silence was its own kind of beginning. Ethan, meanwhile, was escorted home by neighbors who promised to tell his mother what had happened. He didn't brag, he didn't gloat, he just kept repeating softly, "They heard me," as if still convincing himself that it had actually happened. And that is where the heart of the story rests, in the contrast between arrogance and humility, between noise and truth. In a world where money often tries to drown out weaker voices, this day proved something simple yet unforgettable. Truth, innocence, and courage can silence even the loudest of millionaires. Sometimes the smallest voice is the one the world needs most. And on that night in Manhattan it was. And if you stayed with me all the way through this story, maybe it's because something in it spoke to you too. If that's the case, let me know down in the comments. Leave a simple phrase, like "I'm with you until the end," or "This message was for me." I'd love to see who felt the same heartbeat in this moment. And if the story touched you, a like is always welcome. It helps keep these kinds of voices alive and reminds me that these reflections matter to you as much as they do to me. If you want to keep walking with me through stories that carry lessons about courage, humility, and truth, hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And speaking of what's next, there's a video right here that connects perfectly with this journey. Click and let's continue together over there.